Tonight's reading is from Luke 15, verse 11 to 32. I'll be reading from the NIV, which will be behind me on the screen. That's Luke 15, verse 11 to 32. May I remind you that this is God's word. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a different country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am, starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back, safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'"
During his career, Michael Jackson sold more than 500 million records. He is the best-selling solo music artist of all time when it comes to the numbers. Between the years of 1985 and 1995, he earned, are you sitting down, between $50 and $100 million every year. It's a staggering amount of money. He lived an exorbitant lifestyle and was able, I don't know how you do this, but he was able to spend about $50 million a year. By the time of his death, June 2009, he was in debt by $500 million, $500 million, which would help our finance minister get the budget right in our own country. He tops Forbes magazine's list of the world's highest paid dead celebrities. Last year, 2024, his estate earned $600 million in royalties from his music. He lived in wasteful extravagance. That's what prodigal means. The word prodigal, as in the prodigal son, means wasteful extravagance. I looked it up in Afrikaans. Here it is. Are you ready? Verkwistende uitspattigheid. Isn't that lovely? That's awesome. The prodigal son, that's the story we're looking at, one of the most well-known stories that Jesus told. Do you know, ballets have been written, operas have been written about it, Rembrandt painted it, Shakespeare referenced it in 3 of his plays, The Merchant of Venice, As You Like It, and Winter's Tale. One Republic have a song that they published in 2007 called Prodigal. Not one of their better known songs, but still quite good. I listened to it this week again. Jesus is wanting to make a profound point in the passage. Remember, if you were here last week, that he's already locking horns with the religious leaders of his day. They are indignant about the fact that Jesus is keeping the company of sinners, prostitutes, drug pushers, tax collectors. They were moral and religious and upright and very proud of their morality and their theological purity. But the context to the story of the prodigal son is the first 2 verses of chapter 15, which will be on the screen. The tax collectors and sinners were gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." They are the 2 groups that are in front of Jesus. And so in response to especially verse 2, Jesus tells 3 stories, and we looked at 2 of them last week, which you can pick up on the podcast platforms. A lost sheep, a lost coin, and tonight, a lost son. So we're going to have 3 headings, and the first heading is the sinner. The sinner. Very simple outline. The sinner, the father, the self-righteous. There you have it. Easy things to see for yourself in the passage. The scene starts with a speech in verse 12 that would really have shocked the original hearers of Jesus' story. The younger brother says to his father, "I want my inheritance. Give me my share of the estate." You know, in the law in those days, the firstborn would get 2/3 of the estate, of the inheritance, and the second-born son would get 1/3 of the estate. The older son, in other words, would get a double portion to the younger son. But that was only after death. The younger son doesn't want to wait for that. He is essentially saying to his father, "I wish you were dead. I can't wait for you to die. I want it now. I want independence. Rather than living in your house under your terms, I want to go my own way." In that day, in that culture, it would be unthinkable that a son, he might think those things, but he would never say them to his living father. Imagine saying that you can't wait for your father to be dead. Can you see that the younger son wants the benefits of his father's holdings and his father's wealth, but he doesn't want a relationship with the father? That is, he wants the father's things, but he doesn't want the father. And that, friends, is actually a very good description of sin. The essence of sin is the desire to be independent from God relationally, but to still have all of God's things. I like the things of God, my health, my friends, my fun, my earning power, my education. I like nature. I like the strength of my body, maybe if you're young and strong. But I'd rather have it without God so that I can spend it in my own way and do what I want to do. That is, at its heart, sin is the desire to live a life that has moved God out from the center and has put myself back into the center. S-I-N, I in the middle. That's what sin is. If they were shocked, Jesus' original hearers, if they were shocked by the younger son's request, the father's response to the younger son's request is even more shocking. For in that culture, he would have been expected, the father, to discipline his son quite severely for being so disrespectful. Instead, we are told in verse 12 that he agrees to the son's request. It would have been shocking, so he divided his property between them. Now, in those days, his wealth was his land. That is still true in some places today. The only way for him to give it to his son would have been to have sold it. And so in that culture, as in many cultures today, agrarian cultures, your whole identity and your whole life was connected to your ownership of land. The cost to the father to give the younger son his request is much more than just money. It is, in fact, that he lost his status. He lost his land. As one writer put it, he lost something of himself. It cost him deeply and dearly. And so the younger son's actions lead to the father sacrificing his very standing in the community. So the son takes his share and goes off and squanders everything that he's been given with prostitutes and with the good life. He thinks that living away from his father is what will deliver to him the good life. Look at how his older brother describes it in verse 30. Can we have verse 30 up? He says, when the older brother, later on, we're going to come to him, when this son of yours, he says to his father, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home. That's the description of how this younger boy has spent his inheritance. But he falls on hard times, and in verses 13 to 16, there's a kind of downward spiral of how bad it gets. Verse 13, look at what it says. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. Verse 14, after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. That's how we know it wasn't Jewish country, it was Gentile country, because Jews don't keep pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. See how bad it gets? Life is not all actually that it's made out to be or cracked up to be apart from the Father. He's a foreign national, a Jew in Gentile country, alone, an immigrant, a refugee, if you like, who's got nothing, squandered all of his money like those idiots who win the lottery, and the money's gone within 18 months. And then famine comes to exacerbate the situation, and he has to start tending pigs, a life of uncleanness for a Jew. Imagine how shocked Jesus' hearers must have been. And if that wasn't bad enough, he's starving, literally in the pigsty, so hungry that the pig slop starts to look good to eat. And then verse 17 tells us that he comes to his senses. I'm an idiot. I'm a fool. What am I thinking? How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? Here I am, starving to death. So he comes up with a plan, and in verse 18 and 19, he rehearses his second speech. First speech was, Dad, I wish you were dead. Second speech, verse 18, I'll set out, go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And so he's going to plead terms of a service provider, of a farm laborer, not as a son, but as an employee. Perhaps he was planning on living in the nearby village and coming into work and to earn wages so he can pay the father back. And so verse 20, he gets up and goes to his father, and the first scene ends. In my job as a minister, I have seen many times the way some adult children treat their parents. But I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the father for a moment. If it was you and your adult son or daughter had basically written you off, wished that you were dead, and then taken your money and squandered the wealth as they live a life of rejection of you, and now they are returning, how would you respond to that, do you think? It'd be quite a hard thing, wouldn't it? At the very least, you'd be thinking, this had better be good, as you're going to hear from him. I guess that is what the younger son would have been thinking. He imagines his father being angry and reluctant and cold, and actually rightly so. But do you know, the younger son doesn't know what we know, because we were here last Sunday and we read the first 10 verses. And those two parables, the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin, go together with this third parable. We know that actually the father seeks, looks, goes to find that which is lost, and when he finds it, he rejoices. And so let's look at the father. While he was far off, verse 20 says, so he got up and went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. It gives the impression that his father had been waiting and looking, right? Maybe on the veranda with a pair of binoculars, scanning the horizon, waiting and longing and maybe praying that his son would return. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him, filled with compassion for him, ran to him and threw his arms around him and kissed him. Filled with compassion, he ran to him. It's a far cry from a reluctant, cold response. Wealthy landowners in the Middle East don't run. Children run, maybe women run, but wealthy landowners don't run. They are dignified. And running with your flowing robes that he would have been wearing is unseemly and undignified and demeaning. But this father doesn't care what anybody thinks about him. Doesn't care about the neighbors or the community watching him run. He hitches up his cloak, even more indignity, showing his legs. And he runs and flings his arms around his son and kisses him. Threw his arms around him can be translated literally as he fell on his neck. It's quite a descriptive way. That's like a proper hug, right? Fell on his neck. His sweaty, pigsty smelling, unbathed neck. Gross. And in verse 21, I love how Jesus tells it, The son kind of gets halfway through his speech that he had rehearsed, and the father just jumps in. The son said to him, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring me the best robe." And so let me show you how the father treats his son after having been treated so badly by the son. First of all, he calls for the robe. Think about that for a minute. Servants are told to dress the son as servants do a nobleman or a wealthy man or a king. The father wants the servants to respect the son, to treat him like he is part of the ownership of the farm, of the land. And he's given, notice, the best robe is called for. Not just any old common and garden robe, but the best robe in the house, which almost certainly would have been the father's robe, kind of his Sunday best, a robe worn on special occasions. And as the guests arrive for the banquet, the robe will signify to the community that this son is a son, not a servant. He's an owner, not a laborer, and that he is fully accepted back into the family as a son. But then there is the ring. Did you notice? Put a ring on his finger. The signet ring was for contracts. The son is saying, "Let me work so I can pay you back." The father says, "I confer sonship on you for free. Take my ring." You are now able to make contracts with people. You're a fully functioning son in this home. And then sandals. The servants put sandals on him, which shows that they have accepted him again as their master. It's really an astonishing way to treat this rebellious son. And then the fattened calf, verse 23, "Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate." Very rare to slaughter the fattened calf. Very expensive to do that. It was such a rare thing that you can be sure that the whole village would have been included and invited to a banquet. And so there's a big feast. He throws a commemorative banquet to celebrate the return of his son. It's an amazing story, isn't it? I know you've heard it 100 times. But just imagine being there listening as either part of the sinners and tax collectors or part of the religious Pharisees. Can you see what Jesus is teaching? Some of you need to hear this tonight. No matter what you have done, no matter who you are, no matter how awful the stuff is that lies in your past, if you come home, you'll be met by a loving Father full of grace who will treat you as a son or a daughter. You need to hear that tonight? You know, he knows what you've done. He sees everything. Not just what you've done, but what you've thought. Think about what you have thought about this week. Aren't you glad that nobody else can see that? But he can see it. And he still wants you back and will rejoice and put his arms around you. Sometimes we reason like the younger son, don't we? Unsure of what kind of reception we will get from God. Lord, I've done it again. I can't believe it. We think that in order for God to have us back, we need to come and say, look, I'm not worthy. Can I earn my way back? Can I come as your laborer? And what you will find is that you'll find that God will have none of that. After all the Son has done, think about what the Son has done. I wish you were dead. I want your things. I don't want you. Sell your land, humiliate yourself, stay up at night worrying about me. After all that, he graciously confers sonship on him with joy and welcome and warmth. That's what God is like. What a Father. What a God. Maybe you need to change your view of God tonight. Maybe you need to let more of this view of God as Father, longing for you to return, to shape your understanding of God. He is a rejoicing, gracious, warm-hearted Father who wants you to come back. And the Father engages in wasteful extravagance. Best robe, ring, fattened calf, banquet. That's prodigal. And so Tim Keller, a great Christian preacher and author who died a couple of years ago, wrote a book about this parable called The Prodigal God, not the prodigal son. If you haven't got that book, go online and get it. Every thinking Christian needs to read that book. It really is quite magnificent. And what a rebuke it would have been to the Pharisees, who are looking down their noses at the company that Jesus is keeping. But what an encouragement to the sinners. It is so like Jesus, isn't it? To tell a story that encourages the lovers of prostitutes and rebukes the stuck-up religious snobs. I love it. So let's get to those stuck-up religious snobs. And that's my third heading, the self-righteous. In verse 25, the focus changes and we get the third scene in the story. Here is the good son, the older brother. He is the opposite to his younger brother, for he has served his father for years and he hasn't done much wrong at all. And verse 28 tells us that he's cross that dad is welcoming back his low-life scumbucket brother. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. So the father, just like he did with the younger son, remember he went out to meet him? So now he's got to go out to meet the older son as well. The guests of the party and the listeners of Jesus' story would have been scandalized again by the behavior of the father. The older son is causing a scene He's assaulting the integrity of the father. He's not coming into the banquet, and the father has to go out to him. It's a scandal. And notice the language that the older son uses. In verse 21, the younger son calls him father. But look at what the older son says in verse 29. He doesn't call him father, he just says, look. Look at in verse 30. He says, when this son of, not when my brother. You know, it's a bit like when my kids were small and one of them did something naughty, my wife would say, your daughter has done X, Y, and Z, as though it wasn't her daughter, right? This son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. He won't even acknowledge that he's in the same family as the younger brother. He's cold, he's abrasive, he's superior. The father has used his inheritance in a way that he doesn't approve of. You know, and we can have some sympathies with him, can't we? Consider the cost. Fattened calf, having the whole village around for a big banquet. It would have cost a lot of money. More of the older brother's inheritance is being squandered on his younger brother again. Can you see what the older brother cares about? What are his priorities? He cares about the estate. He's worried about the expense. Why not just a goat? Do you have to go to the fatted calf? Can you see that he doesn't care that this would have been one of the happiest days for the father? He doesn't care about the father. What he cares about is his share diminishing before his very eyes. Can you see that actually he is a lot closer to the younger brother than you might think? He cares about the father's things, not about the father. And so the father goes out to plead with the older son, everything I have is yours. Literally true, is the only heir. And even though he's humiliating the father on the greatest day of the father's life, by making the father go out to him, how does the father respond? Verse 28. The older brother became angry, so the father went out and pleaded with him. I still want you to come into the feast. Come in. Be part of it. Stop standing on the outside. Join in. And look at how the older brother speaks to the father in verse 29. Look, all these years I have been slaving for you. Never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. Can you see what he's saying to the father? I have slaved for you. Oh, I thought you were my son. Didn't realize that you had the view that you were a slave. How can you just give things away for free? Unearned. I've been earning for years. You make a mockery of my hard work by simply giving so much away for free. He doesn't realize that actually the father owes nothing. He owes nothing to either of the sons. He owns it all. He is the father. He can give what he wants to whom he wants, how he wants, when he wants. But the older son has been self-justifying. He's been putting his father in his debt for year after year after year. I've earned it. And just as we are on the edge of our seats, the parable ends. Jesus ends the story. We want to know what happened. Did the older brother come in? Did he make right? We're not told. So let me ask you this question. Where are you in this parable? The younger son shows the traditional picture of sin, right? Sexual sin and wastefulness and living a profligate life. But Jesus has turned the tables in this parable. He has shown us that actually both sons have been alienated from the Father for very different reasons. Both sons use the Father for what they want. They've done it in different ways. One has been doing it by being rebellious. The other one has done it by being dutiful. The younger brother's sin has kept him from the Father. The older brother's righteousness has kept him from the Father. Self-righteousness. The younger brother was trying to live independently by leaving and disobeying. The older brother by staying and obeying. And so can you see that what Jesus is teaching, we need to hear this tonight, is that actually there are two kinds of lostness. You can run away from God through immorality and rebellion. Some of you are doing that. You're out of your parents' house. You're using their money. And if they knew what you were getting up to, you would be ashamed. And maybe you should be. But you can also hide from God behind coming to church and being moral and being upright. Some people use their religion as a way to get God to give them what they want, to solve their problems. 2 weeks ago, I met with a young professional guy who rang me up, doesn't come to our church, asked me to meet with him. I didn't know I thought he actually did come to our church, which is the only reason I agreed to meet him. And so we went and had coffee together, and after trying to work out what the heck he was talking to me about, I realized that what he was saying is, why does God not give me success in my business? I said, has God promised you success in your business? No. Why are you claiming promises that God hasn't made? Does God owe you success in your business? No. Oh, so you want God for God's things, but you don't actually want God. That is to treat God like your servant. How dare you? Some of you are treating God like your servant. I'll come to church and maybe my marks will be okay. Or maybe it'll cancel out what I did on Wednesday night. Stop treating God like that. Imagine the joy of the sinners and the tax collectors in the audience. They would be like, yes, Jesus really gave it to those guys, those religious stuck-up snobs. You know, when we think about sin, we have a Hollywood view of sin, very shallow, unthoughtful view of sin. We think Mother Teresa at the top, Hitler at the bottom, and hopefully we somewhere in the middle, nearer the top than the bottom, right? It's not how Jesus thinks about sin. Jesus also divides people into two groups. Bad people who think that they're good, and bad people who know that they're not. That's Jesus' binary. It's not Mother Teresa and Hitler. Now, if you are a long way off, maybe you identify with a younger brother. If you want to come back, you're welcome to come back tonight. Why don't you think about coming to the Father? You've got to come to the Father, though, through the Son. That is how we come to the Father. Luke doesn't include that. Jesus doesn't include that in this parable, but later on in Luke's Gospel, we will see how it is that the younger son can come back to the Father and receive this kind of welcome. It is because Jesus has paid the price of ultimate humiliation and loss by being nailed to the cross for your sin and for mine. But there are some others who may need to repent of their self-righteousness. I've been a Christian my whole life. Really? That's a dangerous thing to think. Because if you think that you've been a Christian since birth, then you might be tempted to think that you don't need to do anything to become a Christian. It's just by birth. I want to warn you tonight, that's not adequate. And you've heard me say this before, being born in McDonald's doesn't make you a hamburger. Being born in a Christian home doesn't make you a Christian. Being forced to go to church as a child or going to an Anglican school or something doesn't make you a Christian. You've got to come to the Father through the Son and ask for forgiveness. Whether you've lived a life like the younger son or the older son doesn't matter. And so, where are you in the story? What's stopping you? Will you stop wanting God's things and want God and a real, living, intimate, growing, personal relationship with Him?